Beneath the crowns and coronets, behind palace gates and stained glass sanctuaries, history's most untouchable women were anything but untouchable. They ruled empires by day and broke rules by night. Some seduced kings, others defied them. A few loved recklessly, most loved dangerously. This isn't a fairy tale. It's the hidden history of 25 royal women whose romantic lives rewrote the monarchy, and not always with a happy ending. Affairs, scandals, secrets, and the quiet power of saying yes when the world expected obedience. Welcome to the shadow court of Britain's most promiscuous royals. You were warned. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe for more deep, unfiltered dives into the hidden lives of history's most fascinating figures. We drop stories like this all the time. And trust us, they only get stranger. Also, drop us a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Are you up late with the ghosts of queens past or starting your day with a bit of royal mischief? We're reading every answer. 1. Queen Elizabeth I. She ruled an empire but never shared her throne, officially. Unofficially, Elizabeth Tudor shared a great many things with a great many men, except perhaps her last name. The Virgin Queen was a title gifted by PR strategists centuries before the concept existed. And while historians debate how literal that label was, the court of Gloriana was anything but chaste. It pulsed with flirtation, obsession, and more than a few conveniently forgotten secrets. At the center of it all stood Elizabeth herself, sharp-tongued, fiercely intelligent, and perfectly aware of the power of being wanted, but never won. Her favorite, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, practically lived at her side. He had private chambers adjoining hers, rode with her, danced with her, and was seen whispering to her during council meetings as if they were discussing treaties rather than each other's necklines. The court gossiped, Europe gossiped, even the Pope probably gossiped. And yet nothing was ever proven. A pattern that would come to define Elizabeth's approach to intimacy. She flirted like a politician, seduced like a statesman, and weaponized emotional ambiguity with terrifying elegance. When Dudley's wife mysteriously fell down a flight of stairs, dead, neck broken, rumors exploded. Elizabeth did not flinch. She simply distanced herself publicly while continuing to keep Dudley within reach, emotionally and politically. He remarried years later, disastrously, and Elizabeth's reaction was icy silence and political exile. She wasn't jealous, she was imperial. Then came Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Young, hot-headed, reckless. Everything Dudley wasn't. He was also Dudley's stepson, in case the court needed more fuel for its twisted family drama. Elizabeth, now in her late 60s, doted on the dashing younger man in a way that had her council worried and her enemies thrilled. Their relationship was either a late-stage flirtation or a political tragedy disguised as romance, possibly both. When Essex eventually rebelled against her, Elizabeth had him executed. It was, she later admitted, the hardest decision of her life. But even in grief, she remained enigmatic. The woman who never married had no shortage of men willing to risk life, limb, and reputation for her attention. Some called her cold, others brilliant. But Elizabeth knew the truth. Marriage was surrender. Intimacy was vulnerability. And vulnerability, for a queen in a world run by men, was a luxury she couldn't afford. So she remained perpetually engaged, emotionally, rhetorically, politically, but never quite available. Her relationships were like performances in a candlelit theater, passionate in appearance, controlled in execution, and always ending before the audience could see too much. Whether she ever broke her famous vow of virginity is, ironically, not the most interesting mystery. The better question is, how did she manage to command love, lust, and loyalty without ever relinquishing control of any? And speaking of queens who wielded desire like a blade, Elizabeth wasn't the only one whose love life rewrote history. Just a few decades later, another monarch, younger, impulsive, and far more doomed, would find that giving your heart to the wrong man could cost you more than a crown. 2. Mary, Queen of Scots. If Elizabeth were, I was the queen who weaponized restraint, then Mary, Queen of Scots, was the one who burned herself alive with passion. Her life was a tragic symphony of romance, rebellion, and rumor, the kind of story that makes historians sigh and dramatists drool. Born to a crown before she could walk, married to a king before she could vote, and imprisoned before she could retire, Mary lived like every decision was made in a hurry. Most of them were. Her first marriage, to Francis II of France, was the fairy tale kind that poets adore and political strategists loathe. She was a teenager, beautiful, graceful, the foreign queen in the French court. He was delicate, nervous, the embodiment of monarchy as a medical condition. When he died young, she became both a widow and a political inconvenience. France had no use for a teenage Scottish queen with her own throne to reclaim, so home she went, back to Scotland, where the bagpipes were louder than the politics but no less deadly. Back home, she made her first mistake, marrying for love. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was handsome, charming, and spectacularly unreliable, the kind of man who looks better in memory than in person. He was also her cousin, which in royal terms meant romantically available. At first they dazzled the court. Then the shine wore off, and Darnley revealed himself to be jealous, arrogant, and dangerously immature. He wanted the crown matrimonial, meaning equal power with Mary, and when she refused, he responded the way fragile men often do, with self-destruction disguised as defiance. The turning point came with the murder of Mary's secretary, David Rizzio. He was her close companion, a foreigner, and the subject of vicious gossip. Darnley, manipulated by noblemen who despised Rizzio's influence, joined them in a midnight ambush. Rizzio was dragged screaming from Mary's side, a scene so horrifying that even hardened courtiers later whispered about it. Mary, pregnant at the time, stayed calm. The next day she forgave Darnley, smiled for the cameras that didn't exist yet, and started planning her escape. When Darnley's house later exploded under mysterious circumstances, with his body found, unburned but strangled in the garden, the scandal was seismic. The prime suspect? James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, a swaggering nobleman with a talent for chaos. Within weeks, Mary married him. The timing was so poor it felt deliberate, as if she'd decided that if the world was going to condemn her, she might as well give it a good reason. Whether she loved Bothwell or simply needed protection is still debated. What's clear is that the marriage was a political catastrophe. Her subjects rebelled, nobles defected. The English court watched gleefully. Within months she was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI, and fled to England seeking refuge from her cousin, Elizabeth I. It was, in hindsight, an error comparable to asking a fox to guard your chickens. Elizabeth kept her guest locked up for 19 years. During that time, Mary's romantic legend only grew. Poets painted her as a tragic heroine, a queen undone by love and betrayal. Politicians saw her as a liability wrapped in silk. The truth was probably both. She plotted, or was framed for plotting, to overthrow Elizabeth, an accusation that sealed her fate. When the axe finally fell at Fotheringhay Castle, the witnesses swore the executioner botched the first strike, which feels like a metaphor for her entire life, dramatic, messy, and impossible to end cleanly. Mary's story is one of contradictions. Faith versus freedom, passion versus prudence, monarchy versus mortality. Her heart, like her crown, was always in someone else's hands. She was a queen who mistook love for loyalty, desire for destiny, and forgiveness for safety. Yet centuries later, she still haunts the imagination. Historians can't decide whether to pity her or blame her. Maybe that's the point, that her tragedy wasn't just in her choices, but in the way those choices refused to fit into neat moral categories. And while Mary's heart led her to a scaffold, another royal, younger, prettier, and every bit as reckless, would discover that passion inside a palace can be even deadlier than politics. 2 queens down, and already the royal court's looking more like a soap opera than a sanctuary. If you're into stories that peel back the velvet curtain, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's still to come. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it as you're watching? Are you deep into a midnight spiral or sneaking some scandal on your lunch break? We see you. 3. Catherine Howard. She arrived at court like a flame, young, pretty, and dangerously unpolished. An adolescent thrust into a palace whose very mirrors taught the language of survival. Catherine Howard was a child of fortune and misfortune in equal measure, kin to the powerful Howards, raised in households where affection was a commodity and supervision intermittent. By the time fate folded her into the orbit of Henry VIII, she was still a girl in a woman's wardrobe, armed with charm and a terrifyingly unschooled idea of what marriage to a king might demand. Catherine's early years were a catalogue of informal attachments and furtive confidences. Before she ever saw the throne from the inside, she was attached to the household networks of noble families, where flirtation passed like currency and promises were rarely written down. Francis Derham was one of the men who remembered her from those years. He appears in the record as a gentleman with a sense of intimacy toward Catherine that was improper by court standards, but not unprecedented in an age when alliances were personal as well as political. Their liaison, if one accepts the fragmentary evidence, seems to have been a youthful entanglement, romantic rather than calculated. Secretive letters, whispered commitments, the sort of romance that reads like the endnote to an adolescent novel rather than a manifesto for rebellion. Everything changed when Catherine was plucked from obscurity and installed, spectacularly and suddenly, as a queen. Henry VIII was an older man by then, and the court around him was a machine of spectacle and surveillance. Catherine arrived like a fresh breeze and captured attention with the single blunt force of her beauty. For a while, the story read like a fairy tale rewritten in Tudor prose. Maid becomes queen, dazzles the king, relieves him of pretense if not of responsibility. But fairy tales in this court had footnotes. The crown carried not only jewels, but a brutal calculus of reputation and the suspicion that any past intimacy could be wielded as a weapon. Thomas Culpeper entered Catherine's life in the idiom of the passionate subplot: handsome, discreet in court gossip, and dangerously available. He became the figure around which scandal would orbit, the man whose presence later allowed enemies to translate rumor into crime. The threads here are thin and often supplied by the eager pens of those with axes to grind, but they form a pattern historians cannot ignore. Secret meetings in royal chambers, love letters intercepted or manufactured, and confidences that became combustible in the wrong hands. Key to Catherine's tragedy is timing. Henry's previous marriages had burned through 2 of her predecessors. The palace was a kiln of political unpredictability. Catherine lacked the political hardening shown by those who'd learned to survive court cruelty with satire and strategy. She was inexperienced in the language of royal bargaining, how to appear desirable without appearing a threat, how to charm without compromising one's name. Where Elizabeth would later stage her solitude like armor, Catherine tried to be both lover and wife, and failed at the one that mattered most in Tudor arithmetic. She did not protect her reputation. Court enemies, rival factions, and a climate quick to believe the worst converged with devastating efficiency. Accusations were leveled, some petty, some plausible, some clearly exaggerated, and the machinery of investigation clicked into place. In that era, allegation and guilt shared a bed. The more scandalous the rumor, the easier it was to turn it into proof. Testimony, often supplied by desperate or vengeful witnesses, was stitched together with letters and hearsay. The trial unfolded in public rituals designed to erase sympathy and create consensus. The woman who was all too young to be a queen by temperament was transformed into a symbol of transgression. Catherine's fate, removed from her status, stripped of protection, and condemned, was as much about politics as it was about personal choices. There is, in her story, a recurring moral ambivalence. She seems both victim and willing participant, a naive girl and a woman who made decisions without understanding their lethal consequences. It is a portrait that resists tidy judgment. She was ushered into an institution that required old kinds of ruthlessness and then punished for not being able to summon it. The sorrow of her end, then, is not merely the fall of a queen, but the failure of a system that gives young people crowns and expects them to know how to survive the storms they did not conjure. For all the court playwrights who cast her as a cautionary tale, Catherine remains a human being in the leftover shadows, a woman whose early intimacies, whether misread or maliciously reported, were turned into high treason. Her life reminds us that in royal history, passion and peril are often two sides of the same coin, flipped by courtiers with ledgers and by monarchs with grudges. And while Catherine's name became a byword for youthful indiscretion turned catastrophic, there was another woman in the Tudor orbit whose charms and choices would provoke scandal for reasons both similar and wildly different. Her story would weave through French courts and English bedchambers, and it begins with a sister, less famous perhaps than her sibling, yet no less adept at turning attention into advantage. 4. Mary Boleyn. If Anne Boleyn was the sister who became a queen, Mary Boleyn was the one who knew how the game was played before the throne was even in sight. She was the prototype, the dress rehearsal, the quietly infamous elder sibling whose name still echoes in the margins of Tudor scandal sheets. Where Anne courted power and infamy, Mary dabbled in something even more dangerous, charm without caution. Her early years read like a continental prologue. As a teenage lady-in-waiting in the French court, arguably Europe's most elite training ground for flirtation, Mary earned a reputation for, let's call it, sociability. Whispers followed her across the channel. The French king himself allegedly referred to her as the English mare, a nickname that wasn't chosen for its nobility. Whether that was slander, mischief, or bitter admiration is unclear. What is clear is that Mary understood how royal courts functioned. Reputation was currency, and intimacy, real or implied, was often the fastest route to influence. Back in England, Mary's name became entangled with a rising star, Henry VIII. Not yet the tyrant of his later years, Henry was still youthful, ambitious, and prone to obsessions. Mary, with her gentle demeanor and easy laugh, caught his eye. She became his mistress, not the first, not the last, but certainly one of the most enduring in the court's memory. Their affair, though never officially acknowledged in public declarations, was an open secret. Henry gifted her a series of expensive tokens, including land and pensions, generosity that conveniently coincided with the birth of her children, whose paternity remains one of Tudor history's favorite unsolved mysteries. It's tempting, in retrospect, to paint Mary as a pawn, used and discarded, the softer prelude to her sister Anne's more theatrical rise. But the truth is murkier. Mary played her role with a subtler kind of ambition. She didn't grasp for power in the way Anne would later do, but she didn't reject opportunity either. When her sister began to rise, Mary stepped aside. Perhaps she knew better. Or perhaps she simply understood that royal favor was a fire, warming from afar, incinerating up close. In a twist that no Tudor novelist could resist, Mary would go on to do something almost unthinkable for a woman of her station, especially a Boleyn. She married for love. Her second husband, William Stafford, was a soldier with neither wealth nor noble status. The marriage was done in secret, and when discovered, it caused a scandal that severed her from her family and court connections. Anne, now queen, was furious, not necessarily because of the match, but because of the optics. Mary had broken the cardinal rule of noble life. Don't make private choices that cause public embarrassment. Banished from court, Mary lived the rest of her life in relative obscurity, away from the machinations that had defined her youth. She avoided the downfall that consumed her sister. possibly because she had already given up the need to be seen. There's a quiet defiance in that. In a world where women were often used to broker power through marriage, Mary made the audacious decision to disappear on her own terms. Her legacy is complicated. To some, she's a cautionary tale, proof that royal attention doesn't always lead to elevation. To others, she's a survivor. Where Anne gambled and lost, Mary folded early and walked away with her life, her family, and perhaps something rarer in Tudor England: peace. And yet, her story casts a long shadow, because while Mary may have stepped away from the spotlight, her younger sister would step directly into it and never escape. Anne Boleyn would become the face of one of the most infamous royal romances in British history. But before she wore a crown, Anne learned how to flirt with danger from someone who'd already been there. And this time, the consequences would be fatal. 5. Anne Boleyn. She was the woman who changed the fate of a kingdom by saying no. That refusal, carefully timed and ruthlessly maintained, made Anne Boleyn one of the most influential and ill-fated figures in British history. If Mary Boleyn was the opening act, Anne was the main performance. Bold, brilliant, and devastatingly strategic. Her romance with Henry VIII didn't just ignite scandal. It shattered England's ties to Rome, redrew the political map of Europe, and left a trail of broken vows and broken necks in its wake. Anne was not conventionally beautiful, at least not by the standards of her time. But she had something better: presence. Sharp-witted, musically talented, fluent in French, and educated far beyond the expectations of her gender, she captivated courtiers without ever needing to flash a crown. Men didn't just admire her, they were drawn to her like moths to candlelight, knowing full well the risk of getting burned. One of her earliest admirers was Henry Percy, heir to the Northumberland estate, whose secret engagement to Anne nearly caused a political rupture. The affair was broken up under pressure, possibly by Cardinal Wolsey, who later became one of Anne's most personal enemies. That broken betrothal, in hindsight, was just the first casualty of Anne's long war with the system she would eventually upend. Anne's time in the French court, alongside her sister Mary, exposed her to a culture where flirtation was not just entertainment, but a form of survival. She absorbed its codes, perfected its language, and imported that sophistication back to the English court, where she quickly set herself apart. Her intelligence and style were as provocative as her decision to withhold herself from the king. Henry was accustomed to women who yielded. Anne did not, and that made her irresistible. Their relationship unfolded in slow, torturous stages: clandestine meetings, obsessive letters, and political maneuvering that played out like a long-form chess game. Henry offered her everything short of marriage. She refused. The refusal wasn't moral, it was tactical. Anne wasn't interested in being his mistress. She wanted legitimacy, security, and influence. In a court where women were disposable, Anne aimed to be indispensable. So she waited, and while she waited, she watched as Henry slowly rearranged the architecture of power around her. For nearly a decade, England hung in limbo. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon became a national crisis. The Pope refused to annul it. Henry, emboldened and impatient, declared himself head of the Church of England. Anne, now central to the cause, was both muse and scapegoat for the nation's schism. When they finally married, privately at first, Anne was already pregnant with the child Henry desperately wanted to be a son. The birth of a daughter, Elizabeth, was a disappointment that would age into irony. Henry's court was not a place known for long memories, but history certainly remembers what he could not. That daughter would become one of England's greatest monarchs. Anne's position, once unassailable, began to wobble under the same weight that elevated her: expectation. She miscarried at least twice. Her political enemies sharpened their knives, and Henry, never famous for his patience, began to drift toward Jane Seymour, a woman whose virtue was quieter, more pliable, and, crucially, untested. The court, sensing a shift, turned cold. Anne, now queen but not secure, found herself navigating a maze of false smiles and fatal silences. Her downfall was engineered quickly and cruelly. A web of accusations was spun: adultery, incest, treason. The charges were as fantastical as they were effective. Her former admirers, men like Thomas Wyatt, once enchanted by her fire, stood by silently or disappeared entirely. The trial was a performance, the verdict pre-written. Anne's composure throughout her final days unsettled even those who despised her. She made no appeals, only observations. And yet, despite the dramatic end, Anne's story never feels like a simple tragedy. It's more complicated than that. She was neither saint nor seductress, but something much rarer. A woman who understood the stakes of ambition in a world that offered her little more than danger for playing the game too well. She bet on herself. She lost. And still, her legacy endured. Not just in the daughter she left behind, but in the structure of a country permanently altered by her rise and fall. But while Anne's fate was sealed by a king, another woman, living centuries later, would wield her passions in a world shaped by poetry, scandal, and regret. Her downfall would be less terminal, but no less theatrical. Her name? Lady Caroline Lamb, and her great mistake was falling for a man who turned heartbreak into art. 6. Lady Caroline Lamb. She once described her lover as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. The line became famous, the man became infamous, and Lady Caroline Lamb became a footnote in someone else's legend. But Caroline's own story, equal parts social satire and psychological drama, is the sort of tale that leaves scorch marks on drawing room wallpaper. Aristocrat by birth, political spouse by marriage, and emotional arsonist by choice, Caroline wasn't just another Regency noblewoman looking for attention. She was a storm with a title, a pen, and no sense of personal breaks. Born into privilege, Caroline was niece to Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, a woman whose own affairs had already added scandal to the family crest. By the time Caroline married William Lamb, future Prime Minister and long-suffering husband, she had already developed a taste for intensity, intellectual, romantic, emotional. It wasn't enough for her to be admired. She wanted to be consumed. And then she met Lord Byron. At first, their affair looked like a Regency cliché. He, the brooding poet with a limp and a limitless ego. She, the impulsive society wife with a hunger for stimulation. But clichés rarely end with blood-stained letters and public breakdowns. What started as flirtation became fixation. Caroline fell hard. Byron did what Byron always did. He wrote poems, flirted with everyone else in London, and treated Caroline's devotion as both muse and nuisance. Their relationship was brief in calendar time, but expansive in fallout. She showed up at his house uninvited, once disguised as a page boy. She sent him locks of her hair. Some sources say they weren't always from her head, and letters that swung between literary brilliance and operatic despair. When Byron finally ended things, in a manner befitting his reputation, coldly, publicly, and with theatrical flair, Caroline unraveled. Society, being what it was, blamed her. Women who suffered privately were pitied. Women who suffered out loud were punished. Caroline wrote a novel, Glenarvon, a thinly veiled attack on Byron and the elite circles that enabled him. She portrayed herself as a misunderstood heroine and him as a villain in velvet breeches. It sold scandalously well and immediately destroyed what was left of her social standing. Her husband, William Lamb, stayed with her longer than anyone expected, out of duty or embarrassment or some mix of both. But Caroline's behavior, erratic, emotional, unfiltered, became harder to protect. In the later years of her life, she drifted through the fringes of society, her reputation trailing behind her like a broken hymn. She was mocked, dismissed, sometimes pitied, but never forgotten. Even her critics admitted she had a kind of reckless genius. What makes Caroline's story so compelling isn't just the affair with Byron. It's the way she refused to accept the narrative written for women like her. She wasn't content to be the discarded lover, the silent sufferer, the neatly excised scandal. She wrote back. Literally. She painted herself onto the page, flaws and all, and dared the world to look away. In the end, she didn't die young or tragically beautiful. She simply faded into the footnotes of other people's greatness. But every so often, a stray reference to Byron's page boy stalker or the mad woman of Regency London reminds us that Lady Caroline was once the center of her own storm. Her life didn't end in exile or execution. It ended quietly, but not quietly remembered. Because in an era when women were meant to keep their passions behind velvet curtains, Caroline tore the curtains down and used the fabric to set the drawing room on fire. And if Caroline's scandal was forged in poetry and performance, the next royal in our lineage mastered the art of balancing lovers, power, and politics in full public view. A duchess, a fashion icon, and a woman who made three-person marriage look as effortless as high society gambling. Her name was Georgiana, and in Georgian England, she didn't just attend the party, she was the main attraction. 7. Georgiana Cavendish, Duchess of Devonshire. If Lady Caroline Lamb was the scandal, Georgiana was the spectacle. She was everything 18th century Britain said a woman shouldn't be, and everything society couldn't stop watching. A duchess, fashion icon, political influencer, and walking contradiction, Georgiana Cavendish was adored, envied, slandered, and, perhaps most dangerously, understood herself far too well. She lived in a time when women were expected to whisper their needs. Georgiana, famously, shouted hers in silk and diamonds. Born into the aristocratic Spencer family, yes, the same family that would later give us Diana, Georgiana was practically raised to be admired. She married at 17 into one of the wealthiest families in Britain, becoming the Duchess of Devonshire and taking possession of a title that came with endless gowns, country estates, and, unfortunately, a husband who preferred dogs to conversation. The Duke of Devonshire was emotionally remote, cold-bloodedly pragmatic, and deeply uninterested in intimacy unless it was convenient. Georgiana, radiant and hungry for affection, quickly discovered that being a duchess meant playing hostess while feeling like a guest in her own life. So she turned to the other tools available to her: beauty, wit, political savvy, and, yes, love affairs. Her most famous relationship was with Charles Grey, future Prime Minister and her deeply inconvenient soulmate. Their affair was more than gossip. It was romantic, sincere, and entirely outside the bounds of what her title permitted. She became pregnant by Grey while still married to the Duke, a scandal of seismic proportions even by 18th century standards. The fallout was brutal. Georgiana was forced into exile on the continent, where she gave birth to a daughter who was taken from her and placed with Grey's family. Her return to England was conditional. The child would never be raised as hers. The emotional toll of that loss haunted her for the rest of her life, though she rarely spoke of it. But what makes Georgiana's story more than just another noblewoman's heartbreak is what she did with her social capital. She became a political powerhouse. A Whig supporter in an age when women were expected to stay out of politics, she used her popularity to campaign, literally, for Charles James Fox, canvassing voters with an audacity that scandalized London and thrilled the press. Caricaturists portrayed her kissing butchers for votes. Pamphlets accused her of trading favors for ballots. She knew exactly what they were doing, and kept doing it anyway. Then there was her relationship with Lady Elizabeth Foster, her so-called best friend, and later, co-resident in a romantic triangle that would make even modern tabloids squirm. The Duke, who had little interest in Georgiana's emotional life, somehow found time to take Elizabeth as his mistress. Instead of dissolving the friendship, Georgiana allowed Elizabeth to move in permanently. The arrangement, complex, emotionally fraught and publicly accepted, lasted for decades. Whether this was resignation, affection, or some strategic mixture of both is up for debate. But it was the sort of tangled domestic arrangement that would have destroyed someone less socially gifted. Georgiana turned it into a lifestyle. Through all of this, she maintained her image as the darling of high society. Her fashion choices were studied, copied, and mocked in equal measure. She was known for towering powdered wigs, dramatic plumes, and an ability to turn a gambling loss into gossip gold. Her debts were staggering, her influence even more so. She was both a cautionary tale and a cultural icon, proof that a woman could live boldly, even recklessly, and still command a room full of aristocrats who both resented and adored her. Georgiana's final years were quieter but no less tragic. Her health failed, her finances never recovered, and her political circle faded into history. And yet, her legacy endured. She carved a space for women in the political theater, not by asking for permission, but by showing up more charmingly than anyone else in the room. If Caroline Lamb burned out, Georgiana stayed lit just long enough to leave an imprint. She wasn't a rebel in the traditional sense. She was something more unsettling. A woman who played the game better than the men and smiled while doing it. And while her life was a performance of paradoxes. The next royal didn't need stagecraft to captivate the public. She was born into the glare of flashbulbs, danced with rock stars, and loved like headlines didn't exist. The rebel sister. The icon. The woman who could scandalize a dinner party simply by showing up late. Her name was Margaret, and she was no one's spare. 8. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon. She was the kind of royal who could make a cigarette look like a scepter. Born into power but never quite allowed to wield it, Princess Margaret was the living embodiment of a contradiction the monarchy could never resolve. Glamorous but confined, passionate but policed, adored but constantly reprimanded by the institution that raised her. She wasn't the heir, just the spare. But Margaret turned second place into a performance art. From the beginning, she was cast as the more dramatic foil to her older sister, Queen Elizabeth II. Where Elizabeth was duty-bound, Margaret was defiantly unpredictable. And nowhere was that more apparent than in her romantic life. Unlike her sister, Margaret wasn't groomed to rule. She was groomed to sparkle. And she did, brilliantly. But behind the jewels and quick wit was a woman whose personal desires clashed repeatedly with the invisible script written for royal women. Marry for duty, smile for the cameras, keep your heart to yourself. Margaret's first great heartbreak came early, and publicly. Group Captain Peter Townsend, a war hero, stable, older, divorced. That last detail was the problem. Their relationship bloomed in the 1950s, a time when the British monarchy still liked to pretend it was morally spotless. For a senior royal to marry a divorcee was not just scandalous, it was institutionally unacceptable. The Church of England, the press, and Parliament weighed in. Suddenly, Margaret's personal relationship became a national referendum on royal propriety. The decision was hers, officially. But the conditions were clear. Marry him and renounce your titles and income. Choose love and lose your place. For a woman raised to believe that public duty was sacred, but who desperately longed for private freedom, it was an impossible bargain. She let him go. The press framed it as noble. Biographers framed it as devastating. Margaret rarely spoke of it again. Her next chapter was meant to be her fairy tale, marriage to the charming avant-garde photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones. At first it was electric. He was an artist, a commoner, and entirely unlike the stiff-lipped courtiers she had grown up among. He called her ma'am in public and Margaret in private. He photographed her in ways no royal had ever been captured. Intimate, relaxed, real. For a time, they were the glamour couple of Britain. But behind the facade, the marriage was already fraying. Anthony was restless, creatively and romantically. Margaret, used to attention, began to lose his. They both sought distraction in the same way. Other people. Affairs were whispered, then printed. Their lives, once staged for public admiration, became theater for public consumption. Margaret retreated to Mustique, her private island sanctuary, where she threw famously indulgent house parties and took lovers of her own, most notably Roddy Llewellyn, a man 17 years her junior. The tabloids went wild. The royal family winced. But Margaret, ever composed, barely blinked. She had grown up understanding that women in the royal family were expected to suffer quietly. She chose instead to misbehave loudly. Whether on Caribbean beaches or at boozy soirees in Kensington Palace, she lived by her own rules, even as those rules unraveled the image of royal restraint her sister had spent decades maintaining. Her divorce in 1978 was a first for a senior royal since Henry VIII. It broke protocol, tradition, and, predictably, the press. But by then, Margaret was less concerned with approval than survival. She had spent a lifetime trying to balance love and lineage, desire and duty, and somewhere along the way she had stopped pretending they could ever coexist peacefully. Margaret's later years were quieter, shadowed by illness and the weight of a lifetime spent at war with expectations. But she remained, even in decline, utterly herself, sharp, theatrical, unapologetically human. She never got the crown, but she wore drama like it was royal regalia, and in doing so she helped carve out a path that future royals, divorced, independent, emotionally honest, could walk with a little less fear. And yet, even Margaret's carefully orchestrated chaos feels almost tame compared to the woman who came before her, a sculptor's muse, a royal daughter with a scandalous eye for artists, and a reputation as the rebel of Queen Victoria's brood. When the Queen herself is shocked by your social circle, you know you've entered a different kind of royal legacy. Her name was Louise, and discretion was not in her vocabulary. 9. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll. If you ever wondered what would happen if you gave a free spirit a tiara, and then told her to sit still, you'd get Princess Louise. The sixth child and fourth daughter of Queen Victoria, Louise was born into a family that prized silence, obedience, and moral decorum, none of which particularly suited her. Where her siblings embraced tradition like a corset, Louise tugged at every seam. She painted, sculpted, traveled, and surrounded herself with people who didn't curtsy when they spoke. If Princess Margaret was rebellion with a cigarette, Princess Louise was defiance with a chisel. She was Victoria's most artistically gifted child, a fact the Queen acknowledged with the mixed pride and suspicion of a monarch who didn't entirely trust creativity. Louise studied sculpture seriously, not as a royal pastime, but as a profession. That alone made her a curiosity in 19th century Britain. She trained at the National Art Training School and produced works that were actually respected in artistic circles, including a statue of Queen Victoria herself, ironic considering the Queen's frequent disapproval of her daughter's social independence. But it wasn't just Louise's art that raised eyebrows. It was her social circle. She moved in bohemian, intellectual circles that included writers, painters, and men whose titles began not with Lord, but Mr. Among the most persistent rumors was her connection with the royal sculptor Joseph Edgar Boehm. The two were close, unusually so, in the eyes of court watchers, and she spent long hours in his studio, which in Victorian code was essentially a red flag wrapped in marble dust. When Boehm died suddenly in 1890, stories circulated that he had collapsed in her presence. Some accounts even suggested he died in her room. The palace, predictably, said nothing. Another man linked to Louise was Sir Edwin Landseer, the celebrated artist known for his dramatic paintings of animals and British nobility. He was older, melancholic, and reportedly infatuated with her. The full nature of their relationship is still debated by historians, and as with most royal rumors, facts are blurred by Victorian restraint and a general reluctance to put anything scandalous in writing. What's clear is that Louise had an affinity for artistic men, and an aversion to the stuffy aristocrats who might have made her life easier but far less interesting. When it came time for her to marry, the choice was, by royal standards, practically radical. She wed John Campbell, the Marquis of Lorne, a commoner by royal blood standards, and a man whose own preferences and personality sparked no shortage of speculation. The marriage was publicly respectable and privately complex. They lived apart for long stretches. Louise traveled extensively. Rumors swirled, as they tend to do when a royal woman seems a little too independent and a little too happy being left alone. Still, Louise remained active in public life. She championed education for women, supported suffragette causes in subtle but significant ways, and was one of the first royals to suggest that the monarchy should, perhaps, modernize its image. She was funny, sharp-tongued, and possessed of a confidence that rarely sought approval. Even in old age, she refused to fade into the background, remaining a visible presence at court until her death in 1939, outliving all her siblings and much of the generation who tried to contain her. Her romantic life, as with many royals, remains wrapped in shadows and second-hand accounts. But what separates Louise from so many of her contemporaries is how deliberately she lived outside the frame. While her mother was writing letters about moral discipline and her brothers were marching in uniform, Louise was sculpting, debating, traveling, and perhaps, quietly, loving as she pleased. If she was scandalous, it was never through carelessness. It was through choice. And while Louise's rebellion wore the velvet gloves of Victorian discretion, the next royal would be far less subtle. Her affairs would be paraded through Europe's gossip channels, and her fondness for handsome companions would turn royal exile into a theatrical protest. She wouldn't just break the rules, she'd waltz past them in full view of the court, preferably with her favorite Italian servant on her arm. Her name was Queen Caroline of Brunswick, and scandal was practically her love language. 10. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. If ever there was a royal who treated scandal less like a consequence and more like a sport, it was Queen Caroline of Brunswick. She was the estranged wife of King George IV, though estranged might be too polite a word for what was essentially a marriage powered by mutual disgust, public humiliation, and a shared inability to keep personal drama out of political headlines. From the moment she stepped into England until her last, disastrous attempt to attend her own coronation, Caroline lived in direct defiance of royal decorum. And nowhere was that defiance more obvious than in her love life. Born a German princess, Caroline arrived in England in 1795 to marry George, then the Prince of Wales. It was a political match, as many were, but this one was doomed before the ink dried on the engagement papers. George already had a secret marriage under his belt, one Parliament refused to recognize, and a parade of mistresses whose influence far outweighed any affection he reserved for his new bride. When he first met Caroline, he reportedly asked for brandy. She later described him as very fat and nothing like his portrait. If you're wondering how the wedding night went, so was everyone else. George reportedly passed out drunk in the fireplace. The bar for wedded bliss was low, and still, they didn't meet it. Still, duty was duty, and within 9 months they had a daughter, Princess Charlotte. Shortly afterward, George moved Caroline out of his life, his palace, and his favor. She was given a residence, a small staff, and the kind of isolation that could either turn a woman bitter or bold. Caroline chose bold. Her new life was unconventional from the start. She filled her household with musicians, intellectuals, and working-class staff who became companions, confidants, and, if the rumors are to be believed, much more. Among them was Bartolomeo Pergami, an Italian servant who rose suspiciously fast through her household ranks. He started as a courier and within months was promoted to chamberlain. By the time Caroline was living in Italy in semi-exile, Pergami was sharing her table, her carriage, and her villa. Whether or not they shared a bed was the subject of parliamentary debate, a national pastime by that point. British spies stationed in Italy sent back detailed reports. Witnesses claimed they saw Pergami enter her chambers at odd hours, dine with her intimately, and travel with her in ways that suggested more than professional loyalty. The government, desperate to prevent Caroline from returning to England and reclaiming her place as queen, built an entire legal case around these allegations. When George IV finally took the throne in 1820, he pushed for a formal investigation, the Pains and Penalties Bill, intended to strip Caroline of her title and publicly disgrace her. The trial was a circus. Caroline returned to England to defend herself, arriving to cheering crowds who saw her not as a disgraced wife, but as a wronged woman fighting against a corrupt monarchy. The public loved her, the press adored her, and the government was left scrambling to discredit a woman who had made herself into an icon of resistance, however flawed. Though the bill passed in the House of Lords, it was withdrawn due to public backlash. Caroline had technically lost, but symbolically, she had won. The monarchy had been humiliated, the king exposed as petty and vindictive, and Caroline emerged, temporarily, as a people's queen. But the final act was yet to come. When she attempted to attend George's coronation in 1821, she was physically barred from entering Westminster Abbey. The doors were closed in her face, literally. Days later she fell ill and died, her last words allegedly asking to be buried as the injured Queen of England. Even in death, she was making a statement. Caroline's romantic life remains a puzzle of implication and innuendo. Maybe she did fall in love with Pergami. Maybe she enjoyed the freedom of scandal more than the safety of royal protocol. Either way, she showed what happened when a royal woman refused to play the quiet game. She lived loudly, defiantly, and without apology. And while Caroline stormed palaces with rumors and lawsuits, the next royal on our list would challenge her crown for public fascination, but with a very different strategy. She didn't rebel through spectacle. She rebelled through sincerity. She became the most photographed woman in the world, the Queen of Hearts in a broken marriage, and the royal whose lovers would be discussed across breakfast tables in continents alike. Her name was Diana, and her heartbreak would change the monarchy forever. 11. Lady Diana Spencer, Princess of Wales. She married a prince and became a global fairy tale, briefly. Then, as the fantasy peeled away under flashbulbs and televised interviews, the world saw something stranger and far more gripping. A woman navigating one of the most high-profile emotional collapses in modern royal history. Lady Diana Spencer, better known as Princess Diana, wasn't just beloved. She was studied, chased, dissected. Her love life, laid bare in tabloid headlines and whispering corridors, became a mirror of a monarchy increasingly out of step with its subjects. When she married Prince Charles in 1981, she was 20 years old and already mythologized. Shy, photogenic, and conveniently aristocratic, Diana was cast in a role that no one, including Diana herself, fully understood. The wedding was televised to hundreds of millions, complete with a dress so voluminous it looked like it might swallow her whole. But behind the public choreography, things were already offbeat. She later described the experience as walking to the altar like a lamb to the slaughter. It was not hyperbole. The marriage began cold and remained that way. Charles, emotionally constipated and still entangled with his longtime confidant Camilla Parker Bowles, gave Diana little in the way of reassurance. What he did give her was scrutiny, isolation, and the faint suggestion that she should be grateful. Diana, already vulnerable and intensely self-aware, quickly found herself trapped, emotionally, psychologically, and publicly. Into this void came affection from unexpected sources. One of the first widely known figures in Diana's post-marital emotional orbit was James Hewitt, a cavalry officer with a penchant for horseback riding and, more fatefully, attentive listening. Their connection began as a riding instructor-student relationship and evolved into something more. By all accounts, a sincere, long-running affair during the late 1980s. The tabloids had a field day when it eventually came to light. He spoke to the press. She remained silent at first, then later confirmed the relationship. It was scandal, yes, but it was also one of the rare moments in her life when she was allowed to be human. Then came Hasnat Khan, the so-called love of her life, a heart surgeon who, by sheer contrast to her high society surroundings, became the emotional anchor Diana had always sought. He was private, grounded, and famously indifferent to fame. Their 2-year relationship was intensely guarded, secret meetings, disguises, backdoor entrances, but ultimately doomed by the same forces that plagued Diana from the beginning: the press, the palace, and the unrelenting weight of being adored by strangers but distrusted by her own circle. After Khan came Dodi Fayed, the Egyptian film producer and heir to the Harrods fortune. Their summer romance in 1997 unfolded like a billionaire's daydream. Yachts, champagne, sun-kissed photo ops. To some, he was a rebound, to others, a symbol of Diana's post-royal liberation. Their time together was brief but saturated in spectacle. And it ended, tragically, in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. That moment, more than anything else, sealed Diana's myth. It wasn't just the death of a princess. It was the death of whatever belief still remained in the monarchy's ability to control its own narrative. But what makes Diana's romantic history more than a tabloid timeline is how it revealed the impossible bind she was placed in. The monarchy expected her to be both angel and ornament. The public wanted vulnerability, but only in curated doses. Diana, for all her privileges, was one of the first royals to fully live and love under 24-hour surveillance. Her affairs were less about betrayal than they were about escape. Her relationships weren't just emotional choices. They were existential ones. She tried, at various points, to balance duty and desire, but the scales were always tilted. Every romantic gesture became a press opportunity. Every emotional connection was repackaged as a betrayal. And yet, through it all, Diana remained improbably dignified, even when at her most wounded. She mastered the art of emotional transparency in an institution built on silence. It made her dangerous and unforgettable. Diana's lovers weren't just men. They were milestones in a journey away from royal obedience toward personal freedom, and each one, in his own way, reminded the world that even a palace can feel like a prison. But long before Diana's struggle to live freely within a crown, there was a queen who chose love so boldly it helped start a new dynasty, one that would eventually lead to the Tudors. She wasn't known for her rebellion. She was known for her second act, and her name was Catherine of Valois. 12. Catherine of Valois. Before there were tabloids, paparazzi, or televised royal weddings, there was Catherine of Valois, a queen consort who managed to cause a scandal so enduring it still echoes in the bloodlines of British royalty. She wasn't fiery like Anne Boleyn or camera-ready like Diana, but Catherine's love story ignited a dynasty and rattled the iron spine of monarchy in a way that no one, especially her son, could afford to ignore. Born in 1401 to King Charles VI of France and Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, Catherine came into the world at a time when royal marriage was less about love and more about politics disguised as ceremony. Her father suffered from severe bouts of mental illness, and her homeland was caught in the flames of the 100 Years' War. She was a political pawn before she could read, and so, like many princesses before and after, she was shipped off as a diplomatic prize to unite enemy kingdoms. Her groom, Henry V of England, the warrior king who had famously defeated the French at Agincourt. Their marriage was brief, just 2 years, but not unhappy. Catherine bore Henry a son, the future Henry VI, and for a fleeting moment she was both a queen and a mother with some semblance of security. Then Henry V died suddenly while campaigning in France, leaving Catherine a 21-year-old widow and England with a 9-month-old heir to the throne. In royal arithmetic, that made her both irrelevant and dangerous. A dowager queen was expected to mourn quietly, avoid political entanglements, and certainly not remarry, unless it was pre-approved by the Regency Council, which it never was. Catherine, being French, beautiful, and still very much alive, was not about to fade politely into the background. What happened next is still debated, but the evidence points to one of the boldest acts of romantic rebellion in medieval royal history. Enter Owen Tudor, a Welsh squire of modest means who served in Catherine's household. How their relationship began is unclear. Some claim it was a slow-burning attraction. Others suggest it was a secret marriage conducted far from courtly eyes. What we do know is that Catherine and Owen had a relationship strong enough to result in at least 6 children. For a queen dowager to take a lover was one thing. To start a family with him? That was a constitutional headache waiting to happen. Their union was kept quiet during Catherine's lifetime, partially because acknowledging it would have jeopardized her status and potentially endangered her children. But even in secret, it was subversive. Catherine chose love over lineage, companionship over court politics, and in doing so, she helped lay the genetic groundwork for one of England's most consequential royal houses, the Tudors. Their son, Edmund Tudor, would go on to marry Margaret Beaufort. Their child? Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, victor of the Battle of Bosworth, and father to Henry VIII. It's a neat little historical irony that the dynasty known for cutting off heads and shattering religious orders owed its very existence to a queen who quietly broke the rules by falling in love with a commoner. Catherine died young, at the age of 35, likely unaware of just how far-reaching her choice would be. Her children with Owen were taken into royal custody after her death, and Owen himself was imprisoned. Proof that even posthumously, Catherine's decisions still made the crown deeply uncomfortable. Yet the dynasty her love helped create would dominate England for over a century. There are no surviving love letters, no romantic paintings of her with Owen Tudor, no monuments built to their quiet defiance. But their legacy lives on, not in gold or marble, but in the bloodlines of British royalty and the very idea that even within the strictest royal cages, love occasionally finds a way through the bars. And while Catherine's romance changed history by birthing a future king, her daughter-in-law's sister would scandalize the continent with a marriage so impulsive it nearly triggered a diplomatic crisis. She was a princess who fell for a duke, married him in secret, and hoped her brother, Henry VIII, wouldn't mind too much. Her name was Mary Tudor, and she turned royal protocol into collateral damage for the sake of love. 13. Mary Tudor, Queen of France. She was the sister of a king, a queen of France for a blink, and one of the few Tudor women who dared to choose her heart over her crown, and nearly lost both. Mary Tudor, the youngest surviving child of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, had the kind of beauty that ambassadors wrote home about. But more dangerously, she had a will to match it. Born into a family where marriage was a political weapon, Mary grew up knowing she would be deployed like a diplomatic chess piece. The only question was when, and to whom. In 1514, the answer came. She was 18. Her brother, now King Henry VIII, arranged her marriage to the aging King Louis XII of France, a man 3 decades her senior with a failing body and an heirless throne. Mary, to her credit, didn't publicly protest, but privately, she extracted a promise from Henry that after Louis died, she could marry a man of her own choosing. It was a clever bargain, and a dangerous one because Mary already had someone in mind. Enter Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. A favorite of Henry's court and close to the king himself, Brandon was a decorated jouster, a respected soldier, and, crucially, not royal. He and Mary had grown close. Whether their affection predated her first marriage remains a topic of historical gossip. But once she became Queen of France, their situation became far more complicated. Mary's marriage to Louis was short. Just 3 months after their wedding, the French king died, likely from overexertion. though not necessarily from the wedding bed, as some later joked. Now a widowed queen in a foreign court, Mary found herself suddenly powerful, wealthy, and vulnerable. French politics immediately began maneuvering to marry her off again, preferably to someone who could keep her English bloodline entangled with continental interests. But Mary had no intention of letting another political arrangement shape her life. She summoned Brandon to France under the pretext of escorting her home. Henry, perhaps not sensing the inevitable, sent him, on one explicit condition. He was not to propose marriage to Mary. They married anyway, secretly, in defiance of Henry's orders, international protocol, and every rule of royal matchmaking that had kept the Tudor dynasty alive. The location is still debated, possibly a quiet chapel in France, possibly an impulsive ceremony in Calais, but the impact was immediate and seismic. When the news reached Henry, he exploded. Brandon had betrayed his king. Mary had defied her sovereign. Together they had created a diplomatic scandal on par with treason, but fueled entirely by romance. And yet, Henry relented, perhaps out of affection for his sister, perhaps because he admired the audacity, perhaps because the political fallout had already happened, and the damage could no longer be reversed. The couple was fined a staggering sum, more a gesture than a punishment, and allowed to return to England, where they resumed court life under careful watch. Mary and Charles's marriage lasted for nearly 2 decades, a rarity in Tudor circles. They had children, lands, and enough royal favor to survive the political whirlwinds of Henry's reign. But Mary never returned to the spotlight in quite the same way. She had been a queen briefly, then a scandal, then a cautionary tale. Her love story succeeded, but it did so at the cost of her position, her influence, and her place in the machinery of Tudor politics. Her boldness rippled through the years. She became a symbol of romantic rebellion, the royal who chose desire over duty and lived to tell the tale. But she also vanished into history more quietly than her contemporaries. No tragic execution, no royal exile, just a life lived slightly askew from what was planned for her. Mary's story stands out not because it ended in flames, but because it didn't. It proved that, occasionally, defiance could lead to something sustainable. That love, once in a while, could survive in the halls of power. And that even in a dynasty known for its bloodshed and betrayals, not all risks ended with a sword. But if Mary's rebellion was tender and mostly forgiven, the next queen would tread more treacherous ground. She ruled not just over England, but over rumors, court intrigues, and the quiet suspicions of emotional intimacy with a man whose name lingered in every corner of her palace. Her name was Anne of Austria, better known to English history as Anne of Denmark, and she left behind more questions than answers. 14. Anne of Austria, Queen of England, Anne of Denmark. History remembers her inconsistently, sometimes as Anne of Denmark, sometimes as Anne of Austria, and often as a footnote in the theatrical reign of James VI of Scotland and I of England. But behind the royal title was a queen consort with a sharp mind, an artistic soul, and a personal life shrouded in layers of ambiguity that no historian has quite unraveled. Anne lived at the heart of a monarchy that was evolving from medieval absolutism into something messier, more performative, and much more public. And in the middle of all this, she built a court that was part theater, part salon, and possibly part emotional battleground. Married to James at the age of 14, Anne came into the Scottish court as a foreign princess, Danish, Protestant, elegant, and completely unprepared for the fierce weather of both the Highlands and her husband's affections. James was intelligent, politically savvy, and notoriously disinterested in romantic convention. Their early relationship was a mix of diplomacy and awkward distance. Anne gave birth to several children, including the ill-fated Prince Henry and the future Charles I, but the couple's personal rapport remained chilly. They fought over everything from finances to the custody of their son. One particularly bitter episode saw James seize the baby Henry from Anne's care, a move that left her devastated and permanently suspicious of his motives. Left to her own devices, Anne built her own court. And it was anything but passive. She surrounded herself with artists, musicians, playwrights, and courtiers who blurred the lines between companionship and something deeper. The Mask, a genre of courtly performance mixing dance, music, and symbolic spectacle, became her calling card. Anne didn't just sponsor these performances, she starred in them. Draped in velvet, pearls, and metaphor, she played everything from goddesses to allegorical virtues. It was entertainment, yes, but it was also subtext. In a world where her voice had no formal power, performance became her preferred language of influence. It's within this courtly haze of art and politics that rumors began to swell, most notably about her relationship with George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. Though more famously linked with King James, Villiers' closeness with Anne raised eyebrows in its own right. Some contemporaries noted a certain rivalry between the Queen and the King over Villiers' affections. Others speculated that Anne and Villiers shared a private intimacy of their own, emotional or otherwise. And then there were the whispers about Anne's ladies-in-waiting. Names like Jean Drummond and Margaret Stuart linger in the correspondence of the time, though always just out of reach. Letters between Anne and her female companions hint at deep affection, dependency, and occasionally veiled tension. Whether this suggests romantic entanglement or simply the intense emotional bonds cultivated in the artificial world of court life remains, as ever, a question of interpretation. Anne never confirmed nor denied anything. She didn't need to. She lived in an era when deniability was a form of control. Her public image remained intact. A queen with taste, culture, and enough distance from politics to be safely admired but not fully understood. When James died in 1625, Anne had already passed, 5 years earlier, quietly, after a long illness. In death, as in life, she remained mysterious. What makes Anne of Denmark's romantic legacy so fascinating is precisely how little is proven. There are no explicit letters, no definitive scandals, just a swirl of suggestions, patterns of intimacy, and the peculiar freedom afforded to women who mastered the art of being watched without revealing too much. She lived at the edge of power, adjacent to danger, and possibly within reach of emotional escape. But unlike many royal women, she kept her secrets. Or perhaps she made them into performances so layered that even now, we're not sure what was real and what was rehearsal. And while Anne's shadowy court left the realm guessing, the queen who followed would find no such protection in obscurity. Her name was Henrietta Maria of France, and her every move, every friendship, every whisper of flirtation would be seized, weaponized, and immortalized in Civil War propaganda. Because in her world, being Catholic, French, and married to Charles III was already a crime. Adding charm to the list made her unforgettable. 15. Henrietta Maria of France. She came to England speaking French, practicing Catholicism, and wearing a crown that seemed far too ornate for a kingdom already teetering on the edge of religious paranoia. Henrietta Maria of France arrived not as a beloved bride, but as a political compromise, married to Charles I of England in 1625, as part of a fragile diplomatic deal meant to soothe tensions between Catholic France and Protestant Britain. Instead, her arrival poured salt into every open wound the English Reformation had left behind. She was 15. Her new husband was quiet, reserved, deeply devout in his own Protestant way, and absolutely unprepared for the firestorm Henrietta brought with her, both politically and personally. Their early relationship was awkward, frosty, and made colder by the fact that Henrietta's French household refused to follow English customs. She brought with her priests, artists, and a cadre of fiercely loyal ladies-in-waiting who clashed almost immediately with the English court. To the Puritan gentry, she was not a queen, but a papist infiltrator. But over time, something strange happened. Henrietta and Charles fell in love. For all his flaws, and there were many, Charles came to adore his queen, and Henrietta returned that affection with a fierceness that caught even her critics off guard. Their letters are among the most affectionate in royal archives, filled with coded devotion and quiet longing. But court affection didn't erase political reality, and Henrietta's French manners, extravagant tastes, and religious sympathies made her a lightning rod for national anxiety. It didn't help that Henrietta loved attention. She understood spectacle instinctively. While Charles favored moral austerity and divine right, Henrietta leaned into theatricality, literally. She participated in court masques, danced before foreign envoys, and surrounded herself with musicians, painters, poets, and playwrights. Her court was a swirl of silk and subtext, and wherever there's art and performance in a royal palace, there's always gossip. Some of her closest friendships became the stuff of parliamentary nightmares. George Gage, a Catholic agent and diplomat, was said to have been unusually familiar with the Queen. The poet Richard Crashaw, who praised her beauty with almost suspicious fervor, was likewise watched. Then there were her male attendants, like Henry German, loyal, discreet, and always nearby. To Puritan pamphleteers, Germain became a stand-in for every imagined impropriety they projected onto Henrietta. But the Queen's relationships were never just romanticized, they were politicized. Any display of affection, any whispered conversation, any moment of closeness was interpreted as scheming. The country, already in the grip of religious paranoia and political instability, needed a villain. Henrietta fit too well. She was Catholic, foreign, stylish, and emotionally expressive. To her enemies, that translated to dangerous. And then came the war. During the English Civil War, Henrietta was not just Charles's queen. She became his ally, his emissary, and, for a time, his arms dealer. She fled to the continent to raise funds and acquire weapons. Her letters reveal her not as a passive observer, but as an active strategist. She sold jewels, negotiated with French contacts, and returned to England with gunpowder and ships. The royalists called her brave. The parliamentarians called her treasonous. After Charles's execution in 1649, Henrietta lived in exile, first in France, then in relative poverty. She never stopped lobbying for her son's restoration. She spent her final years at a convent, still royal, still complicated, still accused of corrupting England with her foreign tastes and theatrical displays of affection. To some, she remained a tragic figure, misunderstood, misused. To others, she was a symbol of everything the English monarchy needed to forget. Henrietta Maria's legacy is hard to pin down. She didn't write manifestos or wage wars with swords. She wielded affection as strategy, loyalty as rebellion, and style as resistance. Her romances, whether political, platonic, or possibly more, were filtered through the lens of a country that never quite trusted a woman who loved too loudly, dressed too well, or prayed to the wrong god. And if Henrietta Maria was undone by love in the public square, her successor would carry those burdens even deeper into the private realm, into a place where affection and ambition became indistinguishable, and whispers of sapphic intimacy would echo through history. Her name was Queen Anne, and her most enduring legacy wasn't a war or a policy, but a woman named Sarah, 16, Queen Anne. She reigned over the Union of England and Scotland, saw more than a dozen pregnancies end in heartbreak, and left behind no living heir. And yet, Queen Anne's name lingers most vividly not for wars won or laws passed, but for the intimate and often volatile bond she shared with two women, Sarah Churchill and Abigail Masham. Their presence at court sparked rumors, rewrote political fortunes, and ultimately shaped Anne's legacy into something more emotionally complex and far more human than her titles and timelines suggest. Born in 1665 to James, Duke of York, later James II, Anne was not raised to be queen. She was, by all accounts, quiet, pious, emotionally reserved, and deeply loyal to those few who breached the heavy walls of her personal guard. She married Prince George of Denmark, a man whose political footprint was light and whose presence in Anne's public life was minimal. Their marriage was by most historical accounts affectionate, if uneventful. But Anne's deepest and most enduring attachments would not be with her husband. Enter Sarah Churchill, later the Duchess of Marlborough, Anne's closest friend, confidant, and political advisor for nearly 4 decades. Their relationship began when they were both teenagers, and matured into a correspondence so emotionally intense, so enduringly affectionate, that later generations could not help but read it through modern eyes. Sarah called Anne Mrs. Morley, while Anne addressed her as Mrs. Freeman, nicknames meant to suggest a friendship of equals. But in practice, the balance of power tilted frequently, and sometimes with explosive results. Sarah was brilliant, sharp-tongued, politically astute, and never one to hide her opinion, even from a queen. In private letters, she scolded Anne, advised her, flattered her, and occasionally manipulated her. In return, Anne offered unwavering loyalty and a level of emotional intimacy that unnerved the court. Their closeness was not just a matter of friendship, it became a symbol. Sarah wasn't just the Queen's companion, she was her influence, her mouthpiece, and, according to many, her weakness. Of course, in the charged political environment of the early 18th century, where the line between court gossip and statecraft was paper-thin, such a relationship couldn't go unchallenged forever. Sarah's increasing demands and political scheming began to wear thin on Anne's patience, especially as the Queen's own sense of authority grew. And into that vacuum stepped another woman, Abigail Masham. Abigail was everything Sarah wasn't: modest, unambitious, at least outwardly, and strategically quiet. She was a cousin of Sarah's, which made her rise all the more cutting. Introduced into Anne's household by Sarah herself, Abigail slowly became the Queen's new confidant, attending to her personal needs, offering quiet support, and eventually eclipsing Sarah in both proximity and influence. Sarah, sensing her fading star, accused Abigail of manipulation, and more. She implied that the Queen's affection had crossed into the romantic or inappropriate, though never with direct evidence. Still, the rumors took hold. Whispers of a royal triangle filled the pamphlets and coffee houses of London. Political enemies seized on the idea of a queen ruled by affection rather than intellect. It was, in part, a smear campaign, but one rooted in the reality that Anne's closest relationships were deeply personal and uncomfortably political. Anne, for her part, never responded publicly. Her correspondence, however, shows the emotional depth of these attachments. She mourned when Sarah turned cruel. She relied on Abigail's gentleness, and throughout her reign, she remained a queen often torn between the demands of governance and the pull of personal loyalty. Her reign saw the War of the Spanish Succession, the rise of party politics, and the birth of Great Britain. But Anne herself remained a contradiction. Powerful yet often isolated, emotionally expressive in private but carefully composed in public. She didn't wage grand romantic wars. She waged quiet ones, within herself, between the roles she was expected to play and the feelings she couldn't entirely repress. And as Anne's story draws to a close, the question of whether her closest attachments were romantic in nature remains unresolved. But perhaps that's the point. Like so many royal women before and after her, Anne's heart was never allowed to belong solely to herself. And what the world couldn't label, it tried to discredit. Still, if Anne loved too fiercely or trusted too deeply, she did so in a world that offered her few other freedoms. And just beyond her era came another woman, less royal by blood, but no less radical in spirit. A writer, a satirist, and a diplomat's wife whose friendships with men raised eyebrows, and whose pen skewered the polite hypocrisies of her time. Her name was Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, and she didn't just survive scandal, she published it. 17. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. If Queen Anne ruled from behind palace walls, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu ruled from behind a pen, and she wielded it like a rapier. She was born into privilege, married into politics, and wrote her way into a kind of immortality that few women of her era could dream of, much less achieve. Lady Mary wasn't a royal by blood, but she moved in their circles, spoke their language, and flouted their rules with a grin so sharp it could slice lace. She was witty, unsparing, and famously unwilling to shut up. In an age when aristocratic women were expected to write polite letters about gardens and gowns, Mary wrote satirical poems about hypocrisy, essays on medicine, and private letters that contained more intrigue than a dozen royal diaries. She was, in short, a scandal, just waiting for a readership. Born in 1689, Mary was the daughter of Evelyn Pierrepont, later the Duke of Kingston. She was educated unusually well for a girl of her time, sneaking into her father's library to devour Latin texts, poetry, and philosophy. When it came time to marry, she eloped with Edward Wortley Montagu, a match less scandalous for the elopement than for the fact that Mary chose him herself. Her marriage was not a fairy tale. Edward was politically competent and emotionally flat, traits that rarely make for enduring affection. Mary, on the other hand, burned for conversation, challenge, and the kind of companionship that involved more than state dinners and polite nodding. Unsurprisingly, she found such companionship elsewhere. One of her most discussed relationships was with Alexander Pope, the celebrated poet and satirist. Their friendship began in literary admiration and ended in flaming resentment, which Pope immortalized by turning on her in verse. But before their feud, there was genuine affection, and possibly more. Letters from Pope to Mary crackle with emotional intensity, veiled jealousy, and a kind of wounded devotion that suggests their bond exceeded professional courtesy. Mary's responses were cooler, more ironic. Whether it was a flirtation, a rivalry, or an almost love that collapsed under the weight of pride, it remains one of the great unsolvable equations of 18th century literary gossip. Then there was Francesco Algarotti, the charming Italian philosopher and polymath. Mary met him in her later years, during her self-imposed exile from England. Their correspondence reveals admiration, flirtation, and more than a few lines that suggest the spark of mutual fascination. Algarotti, for his part, was famously fluid in his affections. He charmed men and women alike, and Mary was certainly not immune. Whether their relationship crossed into romance or remained an intellectual infatuation is, as ever, left to interpretation. But she called him her cheerful philosopher, and in her writing, he is one of the few men who never becomes a punchline. What's extraordinary about Mary isn't just who she was rumored to love. It's how she talked about love itself. Her letters and poetry treat romantic attachment with a blend of biting realism and reluctant reverence. She understood love as a game of power, timing, and narrative, a theme she returned to often in her work. Unlike many of her contemporaries, she didn't veil her opinions behind fake modesty. She wrote as a woman aware of her social position, skeptical of its privileges, and utterly unwilling to be quiet just to keep the peace. And then, there was her medical campaign, a love affair of another kind, with science and survival. During her time in the Ottoman Empire, she observed the practice of smallpox inoculation and championed it back in England, facing ridicule from doctors and aristocrats alike. It was perhaps the most consequential act of her life, saving thousands, if not millions, of lives, yet one that placed her firmly outside the polite traditions of royal women's roles. Mary was never crowned, but she reigned, over words, over men's egos, and over the thin line between scandal and truth. She was a social threat, not because she loved too many or too freely, but because she did so without apology. Her romances, whether platonic or physical, were not secrets hidden away. They were ideas she explored, tested, and, when necessary, mocked. She lived on her own terms, which in her world was the biggest scandal of all. And if Lady Mary wielded a pen like a blade, the woman who followed her would be born into softer expectations and harsher outcomes. She was young, royal and beloved by the public, until tragedy turned her into a national wound. Before her death at just 21, she would become a symbol of romantic idealism and the heavy price it carried. Her name was Princess Charlotte of Wales, and her love story was the one the monarchy never recovered from. 18. Princess Charlotte of Wales. She was the daughter of a mad king's son, and the mother England never got to have. Princess Charlotte of Wales lived just long enough to capture the nation's heart and die at the exact moment it was most ready to love her. Her life was short, carefully staged, and ultimately tragic, not because she rebelled too much, but because she was poised to become everything the monarchy needed, just before it could happen. And in those brief, luminous years, Charlotte's romantic choices made her both a national darling and a political dilemma. Born in 1796, Charlotte was the only legitimate child of George, Prince of Wales, later George IV, and his estranged wife, Caroline of Brunswick. Their marriage was one of history's more theatrical diplomatic errors. He detested her from the moment they met, and she responded with equal parts sarcasm and flamboyant retaliation. The result was a royal tug-of-war, with Charlotte trapped in the middle. As their only child, she became a pawn in a very public domestic Cold War. Even before she learned how to navigate a court, Charlotte was learning how to survive one. Despite this turbulent background, or maybe because of it, Charlotte grew into a strikingly independent young woman. She was not conventionally beautiful, but she had something more captivating: sincerity. She spoke her mind, laughed easily, and displayed a moral stubbornness that made her both beloved and politically inconvenient. At a time when royal daughters were supposed to marry quietly and serve silently, Charlotte was already pushing back against the draft of her own future. When it came time to arrange her marriage, the pressure was enormous. England was in political transition, and the public was tired of the moral ambiguity that seemed to define the royal family. Charlotte, young and admired, was seen as a fresh start, a moral reset. So when she refused her first serious match, Prince William of Orange, because she couldn't imagine being happy with him, the nation held its breath. And then she met Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg. Leopold was everything the court hoped for: refined, modest, European, but not too European, and impeccably respectful. More importantly, Charlotte adored him. Their courtship was cautious but genuine. He listened. She trusted him. For a princess who had watched marriage used as both threat and punishment, it must have felt like rebellion in its purest form. The right to choose. The people approved. Parliament approved. Even her father grudgingly approved. Their wedding in 1816 was less extravagant than expected but profoundly emotional. For a brief moment, the British monarchy had something it rarely did: a young royal couple admired for who they were, not just what they represented. Charlotte and Leopold settled into married life at Claremont House, away from the London stage but under constant national observation. Every letter, every outing, every rumor about a pregnancy became front-page news. When Charlotte did become pregnant in 1817, the country celebrated as if a new golden age had already begun. She was 21. She had done everything right. She had chosen love, married well, and carried the next heir to the throne. But on the night of November 5th, after an excruciating 50-hour labor, Charlotte delivered a stillborn son. Hours later, she died from complications. The public response was staggering. Shops closed. Workers wore black armbands. The nation entered a spontaneous period of mourning not seen again until the death of Diana. It wasn't just the loss of a young woman. It was the loss of an entire imagined future. Charlotte had represented a different kind of monarchy, emotionally accessible, morally sound, and personally chosen. Her love story had felt like a national victory. Her death felt like punishment for hoping. Leopold, shattered, would never fully recover. He eventually remarried and became the first king of Belgium, but he kept Charlotte's portrait by his side for the rest of his life. As for England, Charlotte's death created a vacuum so severe it spurred a royal marriage race among her uncles, desperate to produce the next heir. The winner of that race was Edward, Duke of Kent, whose daughter, Victoria, would grow up to define an entire era. But before Victoria, there was Charlotte, a young royal who lived just long enough to prove that love could be both revolutionary and respectable. And if Charlotte's brief romance ended in national mourning, the next woman on our list would stretch her emotional entanglements into something far more strategic, becoming the whisper behind the throne and the shadow in the Queen's bedchamber. Her name was Sarah Churchill, and she ruled hearts and courts alike. 19. Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. She was never a queen, never a princess, and never expected to matter beyond her marriage. And yet, Sarah Churchill, born Sarah Jennings, became one of the most powerful, polarizing, and intimately entangled women in the history of the British monarchy. She didn't wear a crown, but she wore down monarchs. She didn't lead armies, but she directed generals. And perhaps most notably, she didn't just serve Queen Anne, she reshaped her. Sarah's story is often reduced to her rise and fall in Anne's affections, but that's like describing a hurricane as somewhat windy. She was Anne's childhood companion, political advisor, emotional anchor, and for a time, the most trusted person in the entire kingdom. Their relationship began when Anne was still a princess, isolated, insecure, and desperate for connection. And Sarah, though a few years older, offered the sort of loyalty and candor that the future queen found irresistible. Where courtiers flattered, Sarah told the truth, or at least her version of it. They gave each other nicknames. Sarah was Mrs. Freeman, Anne was Mrs. Morley, an attempt at leveling their social imbalance. It didn't work. Sarah always knew where she stood, just outside the throne, but with her hands on the steering wheel. And while Anne's marriage to Prince George of Denmark was stable, even affectionate, it was Sarah who dominated the Queen's emotional landscape. This closeness had consequences. The court whispered. Pamphlets circulated. The suggestion that Anne and Sarah's friendship crossed into something more was never openly declared, but rarely denied either. Their letters, intimate, sometimes feverishly emotional, read like a hybrid of political memorandum and love letter. Whether their bond was romantic in the physical sense is unknown, and perhaps beside the point. What made their connection scandalous was not its nature but its intensity. Sarah had access to Anne's heart, and through it, to the machinery of the monarchy. Her husband, John Churchill, later the Duke of Marlborough, was one of the most successful military commanders of the era, and much of his career was lubricated by Sarah's influence over the Queen. She managed favors, appointments, even war strategy. It was an open secret that the Duchess of Marlborough could secure positions with a note or end careers with a glance. Ministers courted her. Ambassadors feared her. Anne trusted her, until she didn't. The unraveling came slowly, and then all at once. Sarah's directness, once refreshing, grew abrasive. Her political ambitions began to clash with Anne's growing sense of independence. And, crucially, a new figure arrived at court, Abigail Masham. A cousin of Sarah's and a far more submissive companion, Abigail offered Anne the emotional gentleness and deference that Sarah no longer provided. It wasn't just a personal rivalry, it was a national one. Sarah represented the Whigs. Abigail was a Tory ally. Their tug-of-war over Anne's attention played out across Parliament. Sarah, confident in her place, underestimated the Queen's desire to be handled more softly. She wrote increasingly frustrated letters, reprimanding Anne for her decisions, criticizing Abigail and insisting that she, Sarah, was the only one truly loyal. Anne, tired of the pressure and increasingly weary of her old friend's tone, began to withdraw. Eventually, Sarah was dismissed. Officially, it was political. Emotionally, it was an implosion. The woman who had once ruled the Queen's inner world found herself locked out of both palace and favor. But she didn't go quietly. She published memoirs. She defended herself in print. She reshaped her narrative before others could seize it. Her letters, pointed, articulate, and unapologetically proud, became part of the historical record, a calculated legacy management few courtiers ever attempted, let alone mastered. Sarah Churchill was many things: brilliant, manipulative, fiercely loyal, deeply controlling, and endlessly compelling. Her relationship with Anne was not just an affair of state. It was an affair of identity. She helped Anne rule, shaped her decisions, and then paid the price for believing she was irreplaceable. And while Sarah's power came from her closeness to a queen, the woman who follows her would rise through a very different kind of intimacy, less political, more passionate. She would seduce a king, mother royal bastards, and defy the odds by dying with her head still attached. Her name was Elizabeth Woodville, and she didn't climb to the throne. She married into it, with scandal, strategy, and no shortage of whispers trailing behind her. 20. Elizabeth Woodville. She was a widow, a mother, and a commoner, or at least as common as a lady with a minor noble title could be in 15th century England. And yet, Elizabeth Woodville became Queen of England not by royal birth or international treaty, but by doing what few women in her position dared to even imagine. She married a king for love, or perhaps for power, or perhaps for something in between. In a world where strategic marriages were the currency of dynasties, Elizabeth's ascent to the throne felt less like a union and more like a quiet revolution. Her first marriage was to Sir John Grey, a Lancastrian knight who died in battle during the Wars of the Roses. That war, like most civil wars, was a labyrinth of shifting allegiances and noble families turning against one another for the promise of a crown. After Grey's death, Elizabeth was left to raise two sons with little security, a precarious position in a country where fortunes changed with every sword stroke. She returned to her family's estate in Grafton, technically noble but politically marginal. And then, as the story goes, she stood under an oak tree on the roadside, waiting for the New Yorkist king, Edward IV, to pass by, so she could petition him for the return of her son's inheritance. It was a striking scene, almost suspiciously cinematic. Whether or not it happened exactly like that, we'll never know. What we do know is that Edward, notorious for his appetite for beautiful women, took notice. Elizabeth, blonde, elegant, and poised, was certainly his type, but unlike the others, she didn't surrender easily. She refused to become his mistress. This refusal, in a world where kings took what they wanted with little consequence, was not only brave, it was political. And then, sometime in 1464, Edward did the unthinkable. He married her, in secret. The announcement shocked the court. His advisors had been negotiating a politically advantageous marriage to a foreign princess. Instead, they were told he had married a widow with no dowry, 10 siblings, and deep connections to the former enemy camp. To the nobility, it was less a romance than an invasion. The Woodville family, once minor players, suddenly found themselves elevated beyond what centuries of slow aristocratic maneuvering could have accomplished. The scandal wasn't just the marriage, it was what came with it. Elizabeth's family received titles, lands, and court positions at a rate that enraged the existing nobility. Her sisters married into powerful houses, her brothers were knighted, and her father was made Earl Rivers. The old nobility saw it as favoritism. Elizabeth saw it as survival. But survival was never guaranteed in the late Plantagenet court. When Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, Elizabeth's position collapsed almost overnight. Her eldest son, the young Edward V, was taken into custody by his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III. Her two royal sons famously vanished from the Tower of London, a mystery that still haunts English history. Some say they were murdered by Richard. Others whisper darker possibilities. Elizabeth, now twice widowed and politically isolated, fled into sanctuary with her remaining children. Yet she remained a player. In the chaos that followed, she negotiated with the exiled Lancastrians, eventually allying herself with Margaret Beaufort to arrange the marriage between her daughter Elizabeth of York and Henry Tudor, thus uniting the warring houses and birthing the Tudor dynasty. It was her final shrewd act of political redemption, ensuring that her bloodline continued on the throne, even if it meant sacrificing personal power for dynastic survival. As for her early life, the affairs, the flirtations, the rumors that she had bewitched Edward with sorcery, none of it was ever proven. But it never really needed to be. Elizabeth Woodville was a woman who moved in a man's game, and every time she won, they called it witchcraft. And while her influence came from marriage and maneuvering, the next woman in our story needed no vows to elevate her status. She was never a queen, never a wife to the king, but she bore his children and shaped the fate of an entire royal line. Arabella Churchill didn't rule beside James II, but she did hold his attention long enough to change the order of succession. 21. Arabella Churchill. History didn't intend for her to be memorable. She wasn't born into a powerful family, wasn't renowned for beauty, and didn't marry a monarch, or even try to. And yet, Arabella Churchill, in her quiet, long-standing role as the mistress of James, Duke of York, later James II, carved out a legacy far more enduring than most of her aristocratic contemporaries. She did it without titles, without pageantry, and, perhaps most impressively, without ever really trying to be remembered at all. Which, of course, is exactly why she still is. Born in 1648, Arabella was the daughter of Sir Winston Churchill and part of a respectable, but not especially distinguished, gentry family. Her younger brother, John Churchill, would later become the first Duke of Marlborough and one of Britain's most celebrated military minds. But long before his cannons roared across Europe, it was Arabella who quietly laid the foundation for the Churchill family's royal ascent, not through war or diplomacy, but through proximity. Arabella entered the court of James, Duke of York, as a maid of honor to his first wife, Anne Hyde. She was young, intelligent, and unassuming, a wallflower by most court standards, which is perhaps why it shocked so many when she caught the eye of the Duke. James, already known for his romantic wanderings, had access to nearly anyone in the court. Why he chose Arabella is still a matter of historical speculation. Some claimed it was her wit. Others suggested he appreciated her gentleness in a court full of schemers. A few, less kindly, noted she wasn't considered traditionally attractive. Accounts describe her as having a pronounced nose and awkward manner. But perhaps that was part of her appeal. She didn't dazzle. She disarmed. Whatever the reason, their relationship began around 1665 and lasted for more than a decade, an eternity by royal mistress standards. Arabella bore James 4 children, including James Fitzjames, who would go on to become the Duke of Berwick, a celebrated military commander in his own right. Though illegitimate, her children were acknowledged, elevated, and used strategically in the web of dynastic politics. Arabella herself never sought titles or outward influence. She remained on the margins, a fixture in the Duke's life, but never one who grasped for more than he offered. It's worth noting how unusual this was. The Restoration Court of Charles II, James's brother, was famously decadent. A swirling gallery of painted mistresses, elaborate intrigues, and public scandals. Charles's favorites like Barbara Villiers and Nell Gwynn thrived in the spotlight, manipulating royal favor into land, titles, and fame. Arabella did the opposite. She stayed quiet, remained unmarried, and never made public demands. Her reward was endurance. She remained James's companion longer than any of his more notorious liaisons, and managed to raise a set of children who would go on to make names for themselves in their own right. Eventually, the romance faded as all such arrangements did. James moved on to new companions, and Arabella married Charles Godfrey, a man of status and stability, with whom she had more children. But even after her role in the Duke's life ended, her influence lingered. Her son, the Duke of Berwick, remained a close ally and military supporter of James II, even after the king's exile. The Churchills, once peripheral gentry, were now irrevocably part of the royal tapestry. Arabella's story lacks the fireworks of dramatic scandal, but that's precisely what makes it fascinating. She succeeded in a court built on spectacle by avoiding it entirely. She didn't demand power. She produced it. She didn't trade favors. She raised kings' sons. And in a monarchy obsessed with appearances, she proved that you didn't need to be dazzling to be dangerous. You just needed to be present, patient, and very, very well placed. And while Arabella operated in shadows, the woman who came after her embraced the stage with arms wide open. She wasn't royal by blood, but she became royalty in spirit, adored by the public and immortalized in myth. Her name was Nell Gwyn, and she took the English stage and the king's heart with equal flair. 22. Nell Gwyn. If Restoration England was a theater, then Nell Gwyn was both the star and the scandalous plot twist. She never wore a crown, never married a duke, and never pretended to be more noble than she was. And yet, she captivated the king, charmed the public, and left behind a legacy so vivid that even centuries later, her name still conjures images of laughter, wit, and unapologetic flair. She was England's mistress in every sense of the word, and its favorite, too. Born in 1650 to what one might generously call humble circumstances, Nell Gwyn's rise to notoriety was anything but regal. Her mother ran a bawdy house in Covent Garden, and Nell reportedly sold oranges at the King's Theatre in Drury Lane before catching the attention of actor Charles Hart. Whether she was selling citrus or herself is still debated, but the important thing is this. Nell made it from the pit to the stage in record time, and once she got on stage, she stayed there. Nell was not a classically trained actress. She was not refined. She didn't recite Shakespeare with technical mastery, but she was electric. She had presence, comedic timing, and a smile that made even her critics blush. She specialized in breeches roles, parts where women dressed as men, which gave the audience exactly what it wanted, a glimpse of her legs and a jolt of taboo. But beyond the costume, Nell had something rare, likability. Even when she played the fool, she owned the stage. It didn't take long for the stage to lead to the palace. King Charles II, a man with no known resistance to beautiful, clever women, noticed Nell sometime in the late 1660s. Their relationship started as a flirtation, but quickly developed into something more lasting. Charles had many mistresses, Barbara Villiers, Louise de Querouaille, and others whose names come with estates attached. But Nell was different. She didn't come from nobility. She didn't scheme for titles. She never pretended to be virtuous, and the public loved her for it. While Barbara Villiers was loathed and Louise de Querouaille was distrusted for her French Catholic background, Nell was embraced. She was Protestant, English, funny, and warm. When angry mobs once mistook her for Louise and called her a Catholic whore, Nell famously leaned out of her carriage window and shouted, "Pray, good people, I am the Protestant whore." It was cheeky, politically savvy, and entirely on brand. Nell bore Charles 2 sons. One died young. The other, Charles Beauclerk, was made the Duke of St. Albans. Unlike many of his children born outside of marriage, Charles made sure Nell's son had a title, an estate, and a future. Nell, for her part, never insisted on marriage or pressed for her own elevation. She asked only for security, for her children, for herself, and occasionally for a raise. She once told the king, "I am poor and I want bread," which, coming from anyone else, might have sounded like groveling. From Nell, it was just, good marketing. Her relationship with Charles lasted until his death in 1685. In his final hours, it's said he asked his brother, "Let not poor Nellie starve." And she didn't. She was granted a pension and allowed to live in comfort. But her health declined, rapidly and quietly, and she died in 1687, only in her 30s. Nell Gwyn's legacy isn't just one of beauty or charm, it's one of cultural subversion. She walked into the king's bedroom without a title and left it with a legacy. She used her wit where others used manipulation. She laughed her way through a court that took itself too seriously. She wasn't scandalous because she tried to be. She was scandalous because she never bothered to pretend otherwise. And while Nell was the people's mistress, the comedic antidote to courtly hypocrisy, the next woman to hold the king's eye did so with cold calculation, political ambition, and a French accent that whispered secrets between nations. Her name was Louise de Querouaille, and she didn't just capture Charles II's heart. She turned it into a diplomatic mission. 23. Louise de Querouaille, Duchess of Portsmouth. If Nell Gwyn was the people's mistress, Louise de Querouaille was very much the king's. Elegant, calculated, and fluent in the language of both diplomacy and seduction, Louise didn't stumble into royal favor. She arrived with a script. And unlike the actresses and courtiers who had captured Charles II's eye before her, she wasn't just there to entertain him. She was there to influence him. Appointed by France, adored by England's most libertine monarch, and detested by nearly everyone else, Louise wasn't just a royal mistress. She was a soft-spoken scandal with a passport. Born in 1649 into a minor but noble French family, Louise's early life was shaped by court etiquette, continental politics, and the all-consuming rise of Louis XIV's influence across Europe. She entered royal service not in England but in the French court, where she served as a maid of honor to Charles II's sister, Henrietta Anne, Duchess of Orleans. It was through this connection that Louise was introduced to Charles, first as a diplomatic gesture, then as something far more personal. When Henrietta Anne died suddenly under suspicious circumstances, Louise remained in England under the pretense of mourning, but it didn't take long for her role to evolve. Charles II, by this point, was well practiced in the art of royal entanglement. His court was filled with mistresses of every rank and temperament, but Louise was different. Where Barbara Villiers was tempestuous and Nell Gwyn was earthy, Louise was restrained, polite, and calculating. She knew how to flatter without appearing sycophantic, how to make demands without seeming grasping, and, most importantly, how to keep her French masters informed without getting caught. Because yes, Louise was very likely a spy. Whether she viewed herself that way is uncertain. What is certain is that the French court funded her presence, instructed her to influence Charles in favor of pro-French policies, and rewarded her handsomely for her success. Louis XIV saw her as an investment, and for years she paid dividends. At court, Louise was a master of appearances. She adopted English fashion, converted, at least publicly, to Anglicanism, and maintained an image of refinement that contrasted sharply with her more flamboyant rivals. She avoided drama when possible and controlled it when it wasn't. Her political influence was subtle but real. She advocated for French interests, advised Charles on diplomatic matters, and ensured that her position, both in his bed and at his council, was never seriously challenged. And yet, the English public hated her. They called her the French whore, blamed her for England's Catholic sympathies, and accused her of draining the treasury. Satirical pamphlets mocked her accent, her influence, her appearance. She became the living embodiment of national paranoia about foreign manipulation and royal indulgence. But Louise endured it all with a kind of icy composure. She wasn't beloved like Nell, nor feared like Barbara. She was tolerated by the court, by Charles, and by history. Her relationship with Charles lasted longer than most expected, producing one son, Charles Lennox, later Duke of Richmond. Like many of Charles's illegitimate children, he was acknowledged and elevated, but Louise ensured that her son's position came with land, money, and titles, none of which she trusted England to grant without persistent negotiation. She was never sentimental about her place in Charles's life. She was pragmatic, precise, and always 2 steps ahead of her detractors. When Charles died in 1685, Louise's world collapsed quickly. James II, his successor, had no affection for her, and with French-English relations once again strained, Louise returned to France. There, she lived out her days in Versailles, no longer powerful, but comfortable, and still respected by the Sun King. She died in 1734 at the age of 85, having outlived nearly every other figure in the court she once dominated. Louise's legacy is complicated, not because she failed, but because she succeeded so quietly. She never caused a scene, but she left ripples that altered policy. She never proclaimed love, but she secured a future. She was both pawn and player, mistress and ambassador, soft-spoken and ruthless. And if Louise represented courtly control at its most strategic, the next woman was its opposite: loud, lavish, unfiltered, and breathtakingly bold. She didn't care for subtlety. She cared for power, and she collected lovers like they were decorations for her dynasty. Her name was Barbara Villiers, and she turned seduction into a state institution. 24. Barbara Villiers, Duchess of Cleveland. She was called a dozen things: Lady Castlemaine, the Countess of Castlemaine, the Duchess of Cleveland, but to most of England she was simply Barbara. The name alone was enough to conjure sighs of scandal, flashes of velvet, and the unmistakable rustle of court curtains being pulled aside. Barbara Villiers wasn't a royal. She didn't need to be. She moved through the Stuart court like a force of nature, unapologetically carnal, blazingly ambitious, and as inseparable from King Charles II as his shadow, if shadows could demand pensions, titles, and keys to the kingdom. Born in 1640 into a royalist family that had fallen on hard times during the English Civil War, Barbara's early life was shaped by both privilege and poverty. Her beauty was undeniable: dark hair, full lips, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that knew exactly how much power they held. She married Roger Palmer in 1659, a loyal Catholic gentleman, perhaps expecting a life of modest political utility. Instead, within a few years, she was the most talked-about woman in England, and her husband was quietly pushed into a corner with a noble title and a broken reputation. When Charles II returned to the throne in 1660, Barbara was one of the first to welcome him, and one of the first to remain. She became his mistress almost immediately, and unlike her contemporaries, she didn't attempt to conceal her role. She flaunted it. She was given apartments at Whitehall Palace, attended court functions as if she were queen in all but name, and made herself utterly unavoidable. Charles adored her, and Barbara made sure everyone knew it. She wasn't sweet like Nell Gwynn, or poised like Louise de Keroualle. She was tempestuous, jealous, dramatic, and demanding, and he liked it that way. Their relationship was less a romance than a battle of wills conducted in silk and scandal. She bore him 5 children, each one recognized, legitimized, and elevated in noble rank. One of her daughters would go on to marry into the aristocracy. One of her sons would be made Duke of Grafton. Barbara didn't just bear royal children, she made them into royal leverage. But Barbara's affections weren't exclusive to Charles. While he was occupied with statecraft and other women, Barbara entertained a parade of lovers behind the velvet curtains of her palace apartments. Soldiers, courtiers, and even foreign diplomats became entangled in her orbit. The gossip was relentless. The king knew, of course. Everyone knew. But Barbara was already too entrenched to be easily discarded. She was part of the architecture now. Her political influence, while informal, was significant. She could ruin reputations with a raised eyebrow, influence appointments with a whisper, and reshape court alliances simply by shifting her affections. Ministers feared her, poets mocked her, and satirists made entire careers out of caricaturing her. She responded with indifference. She had what they didn't: access. And in the Stuart court, access was everything. Over time, however, even Barbara's grip began to slip. Charles's interest wandered, and younger, more strategic mistresses like Louise de Keroualle began to replace her. Barbara grew erratic, prone to explosive confrontations and unpredictable absences. Eventually, Charles created a noble title for her, Duchess of Cleveland, and arranged a generous pension, effectively paying her off in grandeur. She left court, but not before ensuring her children's futures and her own place in the aristocracy. Barbara lived long after Charles died, outlasting the court that had once revolved around her. She died in 1709, wealthy, titled, and still infamous. By then, she was a relic of an age that had passed, a time when mistresses ruled not just the king's affections, but the national mood. She had turned beauty into currency, desire into influence, and scandal into empire. She was not loved by the public nor revered by historians. But she was remembered, and for Barbara Villiers, that was more than enough. And while Barbara's story was painted in bold colors and louder rooms, the final figure in our collection wore her notoriety like a soft perfume, quiet, courtly, but no less effective. She was beloved before she was royal, courted by dukes, adored by Britain, and eventually crowned queen without ever needing a single scandal to define her. Her name was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, and she was the calm after centuries of chaos. 25. Queen Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. She was called the Queen Mother for most of her public life, wrapped in pastel hats and pearls, the personification of post-war British resilience. But before the war speeches, before the coronations, before the comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder during national crisis, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was a young aristocrat with a curious smile, a twinkle in her eye, and a courtship history that looked less like a fairy tale and more like a waiting game played in satin gloves. Born in 1900 into the Scottish nobility, the ninth of 10 children, Elizabeth grew up in the grand but less than royal Glamis Castle, a home full of tradition, tartan, and ghosts. The Bowes-Lyons were wealthy, well-connected, and well-regarded, but no one expected their daughter to one day become queen consort, least of all Elizabeth herself. And yet, even as a debutante, she stood out. By the time she reached her 20s, Elizabeth had become what the London press delicately referred to as the most eligible girl in Britain. She was stylish, charming, fluent in both French and understatement, and crucially, unscathed by scandal. Young men lined up to offer her dances, picnics, and polite letters. Several titled bachelors, some with estates larger than counties, pursued her. But the man who fell hardest was one she almost didn't take seriously at all: Prince Albert, Duke of York. Bertie, as he was known, was the shy second son of King George V, not expected to inherit the throne, not dazzling in conversation, but earnest, sensitive, and completely smitten. He proposed to Elizabeth not once, not twice, but 3 times before she agreed. She turned him down at first, not because she didn't care for him, but because she knew what marrying into the royal family meant. It wasn't just tiaras and titles. It was public scrutiny, rigid protocol, and the slow erosion of personal life. Elizabeth hesitated because she understood exactly what she'd be giving up, and how little the palace gave back. When she finally accepted his proposal in 1923, it wasn't a surrender. It was a calculated choice. She stepped into royal life with both eyes open, and from the very beginning, she did things differently. Their wedding was the first royal ceremony to be broadcast to the public via newsreel, a decision that signaled the beginning of a more media-conscious monarchy. Elizabeth took to her new role with poise, balancing charm and duty so seamlessly that the nation barely noticed how much she had already begun to shape her husband's image. She made him seem more confident, more grounded, more king-like, well before he ever sat on the throne. Their early married life was full of travel, children, and public appearances, and for a time, it seemed they would remain firmly in the shadow of the throne. But then came the abdication crisis of 1936. When Bertie's older brother Edward VIII chose Wallis Simpson over the crown, everything changed. Suddenly, Elizabeth went from Duchess to Queen Consort overnight. And though she stepped into the role reluctantly, she never showed it. But long before she became a national matriarch during the Blitz or the mother of a future queen, Elizabeth had been a woman courted by more than one prince, more than one lord. Her grace was effortless, but her choices were deliberate. She had loved, quietly perhaps, and always within the bounds of respectability. But she had been loved deeply in return. And unlike so many royal women before her, her story wasn't defined by heartbreak or exile or scandal. It was defined by influence, by steadiness, by staying. Her romantic legacy is often sanitized. The patient wife, the smiling mother, the queen who stood by her husband through war and stammered speeches. But behind that was a woman who had once been the most wanted debutante in Britain, who had said no until she was ready, who had chosen duty but never at the cost of self-possession. And in her quiet way, she closed the book on a royal tradition of unruly love lives, public affairs, and romantic rebellions. With Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, the monarchy traded fire for ice, passion for poise, and spectacle for something resembling stability. The age of scandalous queens may have ended with her, but the echoes of the 24 women who came before her still linger, on portraits, in letters, in footnotes, and in the untidy margins of history where love, ambition, and power have always made their most dangerous alliances.